The map hit the dirt at Simon Carver's boots with a sound like a whispered accusation, and every man standing in the town square of Caldwell, Kansas, went absolutely silent. It was July of 1879, and the sun had not shown mercy to a single soul in 4 months. The earth was cracked like old porcelain, livestock ribs pressed against hide like fingers through a glove, and 3 ranchers had already sold out and ridden east, broken and hollow-eyed. The Kisham Trail itself seemed to be dying, the grass brown and brittle all the way from Texas to the Kansas line. And here stood Ada Finley, wanted in 2 counties, with her wrists bound behind her back, her dark hair loose and wild around her face, and that leather-bound map of hers lying in the dust where Sheriff Horace Prout had thrown it after tearing it from her saddlebag. "Outlaw trash," Prout said, loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "Found her camped at the creek bend, mapping out water channels like she owns the whole territory." Simon Carver stood at the edge of the crowd with his jaw tight and his arms crossed over his chest. 6 feet 2 inches of sun-bronzed rancher who had not slept properly in 3 weeks because his cattle were dying, and he could not stop it. He had a reputation in Caldwell for being fair but immovable, a man who followed the law because he believed in it, a man who had never once in his 32 years entertained the idea of crossing any line that decent society had drawn. But he was looking at that map. Even from 15 feet away, he could see it was not a simple sketch. It was meticulous. It was extraordinary. The lines were drawn with a surveyor's precision, notations in a small, tight hand marking elevation changes, water pressure points, seasonal flow directions. It was the kind of document a trained engineer might spend 2 years producing, and this woman with the bound wrists and the furious dark eyes had apparently drawn it herself. "You have no right to that," Ada Finley said, her voice low and controlled despite her situation. She did not beg. She did not cry. She stared at Prout with the flat, cold certainty of someone who had faced down worse things than a county sheriff and survived them all. "And you have no idea what you're holding." "I know exactly what I'm holding," Prout said. "Evidence that you've been trespassing on private water rights along the Caldwell Creek corridor. Judge Harper will decide what to do with you." "Judge Harper hasn't had a drink of whiskey that wasn't watered down in 6 weeks because the barley crop failed," Ada said. "You want to drag me in front of a thirsty, irritable judge, you go right ahead. But those ranchers behind you are going to keep losing cattle, and that map in the dirt is the only thing standing between this town and a catastrophe that will empty it by winter." That was when Simon Carver stepped forward. He did not know why exactly. He would spend a great deal of time afterward trying to explain it to himself. Maybe it was the cattle. Maybe it was the look of that map. Maybe it was the way she spoke about the water crisis with an authority that made every other voice in the square sound like children guessing at arithmetic. Whatever it was, he crossed the distance between himself and that map, crouched down and picked it up. Prout turned on him immediately. "Carver, put that down." "In a moment," Simon said, and he was already reading it. The silence in the square stretched like the horizon, wide and aching, while Simon Carver held Ada Finley's map and understood, with a slow and staggering comprehension, that the woman currently under arrest had solved a problem that had been killing this county for 4 months. He needed to understand how she had gotten here, and that meant going back to the beginning of it. The drought had started in the spring of 1879, arriving not with a single dramatic declaration, but with the gradual, terrible absence of rain. March had been dry. April had been drier. By May, the creeks had dropped so significantly that ranchers along the Caldwell corridor were arguing over water rights with the kind of desperate intensity that turned neighbors into enemies. Simon Carver's spread, the Double C Ranch, sat on a prime stretch of land 12 miles east of town, and he had access to a branch of Caldwell Creek that most considered reliable. But even his branch had begun to slow to a trickle by June, and the grass on his pasture land had gone from green to yellow to the color of old bone. Simon was not a man who panicked. He had come to Kansas in 1872 at the age of 25, had built his ranch from $40 and a borrowed mule, had survived a blizzard in '73 that had killed 6 men within 10 miles of his property, and had weathered 2 previous dry summers without losing more than a handful of cattle. He was methodical, disciplined, and deeply knowledgeable about the land he worked, but this drought was different. This one had teeth. By the first week of July, he had lost 11 head. His foreman, a weathered old Texan named Burl Sykes, had told him quietly that if the situation did not change within 30 days, they would be looking at a herd reduction of perhaps 40% before autumn. The economics of that were ruinous. 2 years of hard work undone, and no bank in Caldwell willing to extend further credit to a rancher whose collateral was dying in the field. Simon had ridden into town that July morning to attend a meeting that the county commissioner, a man named Orville Gates, had called for all the affected ranchers. The idea was to discuss collective action, possibly diverting more water from the main branch of the creek through a shared channel system. It was a reasonable idea in theory, but in practice, it meant getting 12 ranchers who already despised each other over water rights to agree on anything, and Simon had not been optimistic. He had not expected to find an arrest happening in the middle of the square. Ada Finley had come to Caldwell County 3 weeks before the morning of her arrest, though almost no one had known it. She had arrived quietly, the way a person arrives when they have learned that arriving loudly tends to end badly for them. She had made camp in 3 different locations along the creek corridor, each one carefully chosen, each one vacated before she could be noticed. She moved with the practiced ease of someone who had lived outside the structures of settled society for long enough that invisibility had become a survival skill rather than a preference. She was 28 years old, though most people guessed her younger because there was something in her bearing that had not yet been ground down to the submissive posture that the frontier tended to impose on women over time. She was medium height, lean in the way that a working life makes a person lean, with dark brown eyes that registered information with the rapid, cataloging precision of someone who had taught herself to observe everything and trust very little. She had grown up in the New Mexico Territory, the daughter of a Mexican-American woman named Rosa, and an Anglo surveyor named Thomas Finley, who had worked for the Army Corps of Engineers before drink and disappointment had taken him somewhere beyond usefulness. From her mother she had inherited a bone-deep understanding of acequia systems, the ancient network of community irrigation channels that the Spanish had brought to New Mexico, and that indigenous communities had been using in various forms for centuries before that. Rosa Finley had grown up in a village where the acequia was the difference between life and death every dry season, where the knowledge of water management was passed from mother to daughter the way some families passed down silver. Ada had grown up watching her mother read the land for water the way other women read scripture, with reverence and absolute attention. From her father she had inherited his surveying instruments, his technical manuals, and a rudimentary but genuine understanding of engineering principles as they applied to water movement and terrain. He had been useless for most things by Ada's adolescence, but on his better days he had sat with her over his transit and his level and his chain, and explained the mathematics of slope and gradient with the focused clarity of someone who had once been exceptional at something before he had ruined himself. The combination of those 2 inheritances, her mother's traditional knowledge and her father's technical training, had made Ada Finley something genuinely unusual in the American West of 1879. A woman who understood irrigation with the depth and sophistication of a professional engineer, but who also understood the land in the intuitive, embodied way that no engineering school had ever taught. The reason she was wanted in 2 counties was a separate matter from her skill, and it was a matter she felt was deeply unjust, which was a feeling she held with great precision and without self-pity. In Barton County to the west, she was wanted for trespassing on land that had been declared private property by a railroad company in 1877 through a legal process that she, and most of the homesteaders who had been displaced by it, considered fraudulent. The land in question had been community grazing land used by 3 small ranching families and 2 groups of Comanche traders for decades before the railroad surveyors had arrived with their papers and their federal backing. Ada had returned to that land after the displacement to retrieve her mother's surveying equipment, which had been left behind in the chaos of the forced removal. The railroad's men had called it theft. She called it recovery. In Harper County to the south, the situation was more ambiguous. She had redirected a water channel on the property of a man named Cleet Drummond, who had been illegally diverting water from a stream that fed 6 smaller homesteads further downstream, effectively killing those homesteads by deprivation. She had done it at night, with a shovel and a working knowledge of earthwork, and she had done it without asking anyone's permission, because she had learned that asking permission from people who held power over you was often simply a slower way of being told no. Drummond had pressed charges. The homesteaders downstream had experienced their first adequate water supply in 2 years. Ada had considered the mathematics of that outcome and found her conscience entirely clear. She had come to Caldwell County because word travels even in a drought, especially about water. She had heard about the crisis from a passing freight driver on the road from Pratt, and she had recognized immediately from his description that the Caldwell Creek corridor had a solution that the people suffering in it had not yet seen. She had seen terrain like this before. She knew what it needed. She had told herself she would help quietly, leave the map where someone useful would find it, and move on before anyone could connect her presence to the warrant in Barton County. That plan had not survived contact with Sheriff Horace Prout, who had a nose for people who did not want to be found, and who had spotted her camp at the creek bend on the 2nd day of his morning patrol. So now she stood in the square with her wrists bound, watching a man she had never met hold her map with an expression on his face that she recognized, because she had seen it before on the faces of people who were beginning to understand something large and real. It was the expression of someone whose world was expanding against their will. Simon Carver looked up from the map and looked at her. His eyes were a pale, clear gray, unusual in a face so darkened by sun and wind, and they held a quality that Ada had not expected from a random rancher in a crowd: genuine intelligence. He was not just reacting to the map, he was reading it. "Who surveyed this?" he asked. "I did," she said. "When?" "3 weeks ago and running. I have been walking the corridor since I arrived." He looked back at the map. "This elevation notation here, this marks a pressure differential between the main branch and the north tributary. If you channeled the flow at this junction point, you could increase the effective water delivery to the eastern pasture lands by approximately 40% in normal conditions," she said. "In current drought conditions, closer to 30, because the source volume is reduced. But 30% of what those ranches are currently receiving is the difference between a sustainable situation and the kind of losses that will empty this county." The silence in the square had changed texture. It was no longer the silence of people watching an arrest. It was the silence of people hearing something they desperately needed and were not sure they were allowed to hope for. Prout stepped forward. "Carver," I said, "put that down. That woman is under arrest, and whatever she's been drawing on private land—" "Horace," said a voice from the edge of the crowd, and everyone turned to see Commissioner Orville Gates walking forward with his coat unbuttoned in the heat, and his face set in the expression of a man who was very tired of problems and very interested in solutions. Let the man finish looking at that map. Prout's jaw worked, but he did not argue with the commissioner. Simon lowered the map and looked at Ada Finley for a long moment. She held his gaze without flinching, without invitation, simply with the steady presence of someone who had learned that meeting eyes directly was sometimes the only currency she had. "The warrants on you," he said. "What are they for?" "Trespassing and property interference," she said. Both situations involved water being stolen from people who needed it by people who had more legal power. I remedied the situations. The law disagreed with my methods. Did you steal anything, hurt anyone? No. He believed her. He was not entirely sure why he believed her, except that the map in his hand represented weeks of careful, solitary, technically sophisticated work performed by someone who had apparently come to Caldwell County, specifically to help people she had no obligation to help, and that did not fit the profile of a predatory criminal. It fit the profile of someone who cared deeply about something, and had learned that caring deeply about something in a world arranged against you sometimes required bending the rules that the arrangement had made. "Commissioner Gates," Simon said, turning, "I'd like to propose something." What he proposed was this. Ada Finley would be released into his custody for a period of 30 days, during which she would work with the ranchers of Caldwell County to implement the irrigation system she had designed. At the end of that period, he would personally vouch for her character to the county judge, and he would ride to both Barton and Harper counties himself if necessary to explain the circumstances of the original warrants. He offered his property, the Double C Ranch, as collateral for her good behavior. It was an extraordinary offer. It was the kind of offer a man makes when he is acting on instinct rather than calculation, when something in him has recognized something in another person and moved before his rational mind could object. Ada stared at him. She had not been expecting this. "And if I decline your custody," she said, "then you go before Judge Harper and those warrants follow you, and the people of this county keep losing cattle until someone else figures out what you already know." She thought about it for exactly 12 seconds. She was not a fool, and she was not too proud to recognize a genuine offer when one was extended. "I accept," she said, "but the map stays in my possession. I work from my own design, and no one changes a single notation without my agreement." "Agreed," Simon said. Prute unlocked her wrists with the grudging expression of a man who is being overruled by forces he cannot quite name. And that was how Ada Finley came to stay at the Double C Ranch. The ranch was larger than she had expected. It sat in a natural bowl of land that sloped gently toward the creek branch, and even in the drought it retained a quality of potential that better-watered land sometimes lacks, a structural richness in the soil, a geometry of field and fence that suggested someone had planned it with genuine thought. The main house was a solid, practical structure of timber and stone, 2 stories, with a wide porch that faced west and caught the evening breeze. There was a bunkhouse for the hands, a large barn, a smithy, a root cellar, and a kitchen garden that was barely surviving but that had been planted with the kind of variety that indicated the person behind it knew what they were doing. Simon showed her to a room on the ground floor, adjacent to the kitchen, that had clearly been used as a storage room until recently. Someone had cleared it and placed a cot and a washstand and a small table in it with evident haste, but also with a certain care, a folded quilt on the cot, a jar of wildflowers on the table that were wilting but meant well. "This will do," she said. She set her saddlebags on the table and her rolled surveying equipment against the wall. She was already thinking about water. Simon leaned in the doorway. He was aware of an unfamiliar feeling in his chest that he did not immediately have a name for. It was somewhere between wariness and fascination, and it was directed at this woman who had walked into his custody, with the bearing of someone doing him a favor by accepting it. "There will be a meeting tomorrow morning," he said. "The other ranchers, you'll need to present your plan to them." "I know," she said. "They will be skeptical. Most of them have been here longer than you've been alive," he said, though he said it as a statement of fact rather than a challenge. "Longer than I've been alive does not mean they know what I know," she said, equally without challenge. "I will explain it clearly. What they do with the explanation is their business." He almost smiled. He caught it before it fully formed and looked away. "Breakfast is at 5. We start early." "I start earlier," she said. "I will need to walk the creek before the meeting. I want current measurements." He looked at her for another moment. "I'll come with you," he said. "You don't trust me," she said. "Not an accusation, an observation." "Not yet," he said honestly. "But I'm also not letting the woman responsible for my ranch's future walk the creek alone before dawn in county full of desperate men." Something shifted fractionally in her expression. It was not quite warmth, but it was the precursor to it, a small thawing at the edge of her careful composure. "Fine," she said. She was up at 4. He was already on the porch when she came out, 2 tin mugs of coffee in his hands, one of which he held out to her. She took it without comment, and they walked together in the pre-dawn dark toward the creek. What happened on that walk was not dramatic. It was quiet and functional. She carried her instruments, a small transit, a level rod, and her measuring chain, and she moved along the creek with the efficient purposefulness of someone who has done this 1,000 times. She measured, she noted. She occasionally crouched to examine the substrate of the creek, pressing her fingers into the soil and reading it the way a doctor reads a pulse. She spoke only to explain what she was finding in terse, technical sentences that assumed he could follow if he tried. He tried very hard. By the time the sun came up, Simon Carver had learned more about water management in 60 minutes than he had accumulated in 12 years of ranching, and he was experiencing the specific, productive discomfort of a person who is discovering that a subject they thought they understood reasonably well is actually vastly more complex and interesting than they had realized. "At this junction," Ada said, standing at the point where the north tributary met the main branch, the water barely a whisper over the stones, "there is a natural gravel bar that is partially blocking the flow. It formed over the winter. If we break it up and channel the flow here," she indicated the spot with her measuring rod, "and build a diversion structure here, we can increase pressure in the eastern branch by enough to make a significant difference." "A diversion structure," Simon said. "You mean a dam?" "Not a dam, a weir, much smaller. It does not block the flow, it manages it. Raises the water level upstream slightly, redirects a portion of the flow, and allows the rest to continue. It can be built from materials that already exist on this creek. Stone, timber, packed earth, 2 weeks of work with enough hands." He looked at the junction. He looked at her. "You've built one before," he said. "I've built 4, she said. He was quiet for a moment. The creek murmured around their boots. A meadowlark was singing somewhere upstream, absurdly cheerful for the circumstances. "Ada," he said, and then stopped. She looked at him. It was the first time he had used her given name, and something in it made her chest do a complicated thing that she did not appreciate and did not intend to examine. "What you've done here," he said. "This map, these measurements. You came here specifically to help people who don't know you exist." "I came here because I could help," she said, as if the explanation were simpler than he was making it. "You came here with warrants on your name at personal risk to map a water system for strangers," he said. She turned away from him and began packing her instruments. "The situation required it. I had the knowledge. I applied it." "Most people don't think that way," he said. "Most people have not watched a village die slowly from thirst because no one with the knowledge cared enough to act," she said quietly. Her hands moved efficiently on her instrument case, and her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it that told him the statement had weight beyond the abstract. It came from somewhere real and specific and painful. He did not push. He filed it away. The meeting at the Caldwell Grange Hall that morning was exactly as difficult as Ada had predicted, and slightly more difficult than Simon had hoped. 12 ranchers, ranging in age from 24 to 67, in various stages of desperation and defensiveness, sitting on hard chairs in a room that smelled of dust and old coffee, and the particular anxiety of men who are watching their livelihoods erode. The moment Ada walked in with Simon, the temperature in the room dropped about 5 degrees, conversationally speaking. "This is the woman," said Emmett Rush, 51, the largest landowner in the Eastern Corridor, a man whose opinion moved other men like weather moves dust. "The one Prout had in cuffs yesterday." "This is Ada Finley," Simon said. She has a plan for the water situation that I believe is worth hearing." "She's an outlaw," said Rush. "She's a hydrologist," Simon said, using the word with slight uncertainty because it was a word Ada had used that morning and he had decided to trust it without being entirely sure he was using it correctly. Ada set her map on the central table. She had unrolled it and weighted the corners with stones she had brought from the creek, and she began to speak. She spoke for 40 minutes without notes, without hesitation, without apology. She explained the water system of the Caldwell Creek corridor in its current state, and in the state it could be with 3 specific interventions. The weir at the North Tributary Junction, a secondary channel to be dug along the eastern pasture boundary, and a series of small holding ponds distributed across 4 properties that would capture and store any rainfall and maintain the water pressure in the channels during extended dry periods. She explained the engineering principles, the labor requirements, the material costs, and the projected outcomes for each affected ranch with a specificity that made the air in the room feel different, thicker with information, bristling with possibility. When she finished, there was a silence. Then Emmett Rush said, "Where did you learn all this?" "From my mother," Ada said. "From my father, from 14 years of working with water in terrain like this." "You're a woman," said a younger rancher named Carl Webb as if this were a relevant objection. "I am," she agreed pleasantly. "And your cattle are dying. Would you like to keep discussing my gender, or would you like to save your herd?" Simon put his hand over his mouth to prevent himself from laughing. The meeting ended with an agreement, grudging and fractious and achieved only because desperation is a more powerful motivator than pride, to allow Ada Finley to supervise the construction of the irrigation improvements, with labor contributed collectively by the 12 ranches according to their size and capacity. The first week of work was brutal. The summer heat was relentless. The ground was iron-hard, and the men working the channels were not accustomed to taking direction from a woman. There were moments of open resistance, tools set down, arguments about methodology, a few pointed attempts to simply do things the way they had always been done rather than the way Ada specified. Ada handled each instance with the same quality she had brought to everything, patience combined with absolute precision. She did not lose her temper. She explained, demonstrated, explained again. When a man set down his tools and walked away, she picked up the tools and did the work herself until someone, either shamed or pragmatic or both, came back and took over. She worked from before sunrise to after sunset, measuring, adjusting, making calculations on scraps of paper with a small carpenter's pencil she kept behind her ear. She got dirty. She got sunburned. She did not complain about either. Simon watched her. He watched her more than was strictly necessary for oversight purposes, and he was honest enough with himself to know it. There was something about her that he could not stop cataloging, the way she moved, the way she thought, the way she held her arguments in reserve until the moment they were most useful, and then deployed them with surgical accuracy. He had known strong women before. His mother had been a formidable person. There had been a widow in Dodge City years ago who had run a cattle operation that made most men's look modest. But he had not before encountered someone who combined this particular kind of intellectual force with this particular kind of physical capability, and what seemed to be a completely untroubled sense of her own worth. She was not warm with him. Not cold either, but guarded in a way that had the quality of habit rather than of personal dislike. She answered his questions, accepted his assistance without comment, and at the end of each exhausting day she sat on the porch of the ranch with her notes and a cup of coffee and worked in silence while the stars came out. He started sitting on the porch too, at the other end, ostensibly with paperwork of his own. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who are learning each other's rhythms without having agreed to do so. The first time something cracked slightly in that guardedness was at the end of the 8th day, when the weir at the North Tributary Junction was finally completed, and they opened the channel to let the redirected flow through. Ada stood at the downstream end of the new channel and watched the water come. It came slowly at first, feeling its way through the new cut earth, and then it gathered itself and moved with purpose, and the sound it made was the sound of dry land beginning to breathe again. The western light was turning everything gold and pink, and the water caught the color and ran with it, and Ada Finley stood in the stream with her boots soaking, and her face turned toward the sky with an expression that Simon had never seen on her before and that he knew, with a certainty that surprised him, he would never forget. She was radiant with it. Not pretty, though she was that too, but luminous in the way that people are luminous when they are watching the thing they care most about in the world happen exactly as they intended. He stood beside her, also in the water because he had simply followed her when she waded in, and for a moment neither of them said anything. "It works," he said. He was aware of the inadequacy of the statement. "It always works," she said, but her voice was different from how it usually was. Softer. Unguarded in a way she had not let herself be before. "You've done this before," he said. "Built something that saved a place. And then what? You moved on." She turned her face down from the sky and looked at the water. "Yes." "Why?" "Because places are never saved permanently," she said. "There is always another drought, another Drummond diverting water upstream, another railroad taking what does not belong to it. I go where the need is and I do what I can and then I go on." "That sounds lonely," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "It sounds efficient," she said. But he had seen her face a moment ago, and he knew that efficiency was not the whole of it, and he thought she knew he knew, because she waded out of the stream and did not look at him again until dinner. The dinner that evening was the first time she had eaten with the hands rather than separately in her room, and it was the first time Simon had seen her laugh. Burl Sykes, his foreman, was telling a story about a steer that had gotten itself comprehensively stuck in a fence post configuration that should have been geometrically impossible, and the story was delivered with the kind of slow, deadpan precision that Burl had perfected over decades. And Ada laughed, an actual laugh, not polite amusement but something genuine and sudden that lit her whole face and startled everyone at the table, including herself. She caught Simon looking at her and looked away, but the corner of her mouth stayed up. He was in trouble. He knew it with the clarity of a man who has not been in trouble of this particular kind for a very long time and recognizes the symptoms even while he is doing almost nothing about them. The second week brought complications that had nothing to do with engineering. The first complication was Emmett Rush, who arrived at the Double C on a Tuesday morning with two of his ranch hands, and a demand that the secondary channel be rerouted to give his eastern pasture a greater share of the water flow than Ada's calculations had allocated. Ada listened to his demand with her arms crossed and her expression politely attentive. Then she explained, for the second time, why the current allocation was not arbitrary favoritism, but a function of the terrain gradient and the water pressure dynamics, and why giving his eastern pasture more than its calculated share would reduce the pressure in the channel system to the point of making it ineffective for everyone. Rush did not like the explanation. Rush was a man accustomed to getting what he demanded, and he looked at Ada with the particular contempt that certain men reserve for capable women who decline to defer to them. "I don't take direction from a wanted woman on my own land," he said. "Then your cattle will keep dying on it," she said. "I could have you arrested again," he said. "You could try," she said. Sheriff Prout tried. It did not improve the water situation. Rush turned to Simon. "Carver, control your—" He gestured at Ada in a way that was not quite a word but was very much an implication. Simon straightened to his full height, which was considerable. "She's right," he said, "about the water allocation. She's explained it twice and she'll explain it a third time if you want to listen, but the answer isn't going to change. The math doesn't change because you want it to." Rush stared at him. Something in Simon's tone made the staring unproductive. Rush left. His hands followed. The channel allocation stayed as Ada had designed it. Ada watched his departure from the porch. When Simon came to stand beside her, she said without turning, "Thank you." "I didn't say anything that wasn't true," he said. "No, but you said it, which is different from me saying it alone." He understood what she meant. The ugliness of that reality, that her words required a man's corroboration to carry the weight they deserved, was something he registered with the slow, uncomfortable recognition of a fair person encountering an unfairness they had not previously had reason to notice. "I'm sorry that's how it is," he said. She looked at him then, and something in the look was searching, as if she were testing whether the statement was genuine or performative. Whatever she found seemed to satisfy her. "So am I," she said, "but it is how it is." The second complication arrived on Thursday in the form of a man named Cole Vance, who rode in from the south with a deputy's badge from Harper County and a warrant for Ada Finley's arrest in the matter of the Drummond property. Simon was in the barn when it happened. He came out to find Ada standing in the yard, arms loose at her sides, and Cole Vance on his horse with the warrant in his hand and the expression of a man who is doing a job he has been told to do and is not entirely sure he feels good about it. Simon read the warrant. It was legitimate. He could not tear it up, and he could not simply refuse it, because that would cross a line that even his current feelings about Ada Finley could not justify crossing. He looked at Ada. She was watching him with the expression she wore when she was calculating odds, rapid, still, and utterly unreadable. "I'll ride to Pratt myself," he said. "I'll speak to the county judge there." This warrant was filed by Drummond, but there are 6 homesteaders who will testify that what you did on that property saved their water supply. That is a legitimate counterargument to the trespass charge. "That will take time," she said. "Time I may not have if Deputy Vance is taking me back tonight." "Deputy," Simon said, turning to Vance, "I am asking you for 3 days. Give me 3 days to speak to your judge. The woman in this warrant has been operating under my custody by agreement with Commissioner Gates and will continue to do so. She is not a flight risk." Vance looked uncertain. He looked at Ada. He looked at Simon. "I know who you are, Carver," he said. "Heard of you. You've got a reputation for being straight." "Then trust it," Simon said. Vance thought it over for a long moment. 3 days, he said. "Then I come back, and if there's no resolution, I have to take her." He rode out. Ada was quiet for a long time after. The silence had a different quality from her usual silences. It was less controlled, more pressured, and Simon thought he could see, for the first time, a hairline fracture in her composure. "You don't have to do this," she said. "Ride to Pratt. It's 3 days of travel, 3 days of your time, and you have a ranch to run and an irrigation project to finish." "Burl can oversee the project for 3 days," Simon said. "He's been watching you closely enough that he knows the plan." "That's not the point," she said. "I know it isn't," he said. "Ada," she looked up, "you came here to help people who didn't ask for it and who weren't kind to you when you arrived. You did extraordinary work in 2 weeks under difficult conditions. You are not going to prison because Cleet Drummond is angry that his illegal diversion got fixed." She looked at him for a long, long moment. Her jaw was tight. Her eyes were very bright in a way that had nothing to do with crying but everything to do with the effort of not doing it. "You are a decent man, Simon Carver," she said. "An unusual one." "I've been called worse," he said. Something broke open between them in that moment, not dramatically, not with any of the signals that announce these things in stories, but quietly, the way a door that has been stuck for a long time finally moves, with a slight catch and then a sudden ease. She did not reach for him, and he did not reach for her. They simply stood in the yard in the afternoon heat and looked at each other with the new, complicated knowledge that something had shifted between them that was not going to shift back. He rode to Pratt the next morning. It was not a simple journey. The road was dry and the summer heat was savage, and the 30 miles each way was the kind of travel that tested a horse and a man both. He arrived in Pratt on the evening of the first day and found the county judge, a deliberate man named Judge Aldrich, at his supper. Aldrich listened. Simon had brought written statements from Commissioner Gates and from 2 of the Eastern Corridor ranchers, testifying to the severity of the water crisis and to Ada's knowledge and conduct in addressing it. He explained the Drummond situation as fully as he understood it, which was not perfectly fully, but he was honest about the gaps in his knowledge and honest about why he believed the warrant was an unjust one. He also, and this surprised him as he did it, spoke to Aldrich about Ada herself, about the quality of her knowledge, about the weeks of careful, solitary work she had done mapping the corridor before her arrest, about the meeting in the Grange Hall, and the way she had explained the water system to 12 skeptical men until they understood it well enough to act on it, about the weir and the channel and the holding ponds and the way the water had moved through the new channel on the evening it was first opened, and about the expression on her face when it did. Aldrich was quiet for a while after Simon finished. "You're personally invested in this woman's situation," Aldrich said. "Yes," Simon said without evasion. "Personally," Aldrich said. "Yes," Simon said again. Aldrich studied him. He was a man who read people for a living, and he read Simon Carver now with the focused attention of someone who takes the reading seriously. "I'll review the Drummond warrant," Aldrich said. "Drummond has a history in this county that is not entirely flattering. If the facts are as you've described, the trespass charge is weak, and the property interference charge requires demonstrating harm, which is difficult when the purported interference was correcting an illegal diversion. Come back in the morning." Simon slept 4 hours in the Pratt Hotel and was back at Aldrich's office when it opened. Aldrich had the warrant set aside pending a full review that he expected to conclude in Ada's favor within the week. He wrote a letter to that effect addressed to Deputy Vance, suspending the enforcement of the warrant for 30 days pending his review. Simon rode back to Caldwell with the letter in his coat pocket, and the feeling in his chest that he had been carrying since the morning at the creek growing louder with every mile. He arrived back at the Double C on the evening of the second day to find Ada on the porch with her notes, exactly where he would have expected to find her, except that when she looked up at his arrival her face did something he had not seen it do before. It relaxed. Completely. For just a moment, before she controlled it again, she looked relieved in a way that was not entirely about the legal situation. He came up the porch steps and held out Aldrich's letter. She took it, read it, and set it carefully on the table beside her notes. "You did that in 2 days," she said. "Aldrich is a reasonable man," Simon said. "You advocated for me to a county judge," she said. "A man you met 3 weeks ago at her arrest." "A woman," he said gently. "A woman I met, who has not yet stopped correcting her own pronouns in my head since that morning." She stared at him. "I beg your pardon. I keep using her and then thinking, no, I mean Ada, and that's different," he said. And he was aware he was not saying this very clearly, but he was tired from 2 days of hard riding and he was looking at her face in the evening light, and his usual precision of expression had apparently gone somewhere else for the evening. "You're not a pronoun to me. You're a specific person who he stopped. "Who you what?" she said very quietly. "Who I would like to know better," he said, "if you're willing. And if your plans after this county allow for it." She was quiet for a long time. The evening came on around them, the sky turning its deep western purple, the first stars appearing, the creek in the distance making its new, stronger sound. "My plans after this county have not previously included much allowance for anything beyond the next place that needs help," she said. "I know," he said. "I don't stay," she said. "I have not stayed anywhere in 4 years." "I know that too," he said. "I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight. I'm telling you where I stand. What you do with that information is your business." She looked at him for a long moment with those dark, precise eyes that missed nothing. Then she picked up her notes and stood up. "Good night, Simon," she said. "Good night, Ada," he said. She went inside. He stayed on the porch and looked at the stars and felt, underneath the exhaustion and the uncertainty and the complicated practical reality of their situation, something that was unmistakably, inconveniently, and entirely completely hope. The 3rd week of the project brought the first rain. It was not much of a rain, 30 minutes on a Wednesday afternoon, the sky barely committing to it, more a statement of intention than a delivery of substance. But the holding ponds caught what they could, and the channels directed the runoff with the efficiency Ada had designed them for. And the next morning the north tributary was running at a level that made 3 of the ranchers openly emotional in ways that men of that era and that culture were not accustomed to being. Ada showed Simon how the holding ponds were working, walking him around each one with the proprietary satisfaction of an architect showing someone around a completed building. She explained the mathematics of catchment area versus pond capacity, the gradient that directed the overflow from one pond to the next without human intervention, the way the system would function even in partial rains because it was designed to make maximum use of minimum input. He watched her explain it and felt the same thing he had felt at the creek junction on the morning of her first measurements, the staggering, productive shock of encountering an intelligence that outpaced his expectations entirely, not in a way that diminished him, but in a way that expanded the world. "You designed this without any formal training," he said. "I had some formal training," she said. "My father's books and 2 years working with an engineer in Santa Fe who was building water systems for the Pueblo communities south of the city. He was one of the people who actually took me seriously as a student." A pause. "There were not many. Tell me about them," he said. "The ones who did." She looked at him, weighing. Then she told him. She told him about the engineer in Santa Fe, a man named Eduardo Reyes who had been the first person to look at her calculations and say, without surprise or condescension, that they were correct. She told him about her mother, about the acequia, about the summer she was 9 years old, and the acequia committee had let her walk the channel with them during the annual cleaning and inspection, and she had been so happy she had not been able to sleep. She told him about her father's better days, the survey work, the way the mathematics of terrain had opened up before her like a language she had always known and was only now learning to read aloud. And then, more quietly, she told him about the village in New Mexico where she had spent 3 years as a young woman, working with the acequia system after the death of her mother, and how a drought not unlike this one had come, and how she had built her first weir at the age of 22 and watched the water move through it and felt, for the first time in years, that she was in exactly the right place doing exactly the right thing, and how a railroad company had begun buying the land around the village, and how the water rights had been signed over in a legal process that no one in the village had fully understood, and how the water had been slowly, systematically redirected to serve the railroad's construction projects, and how the village had emptied over 2 years, family by family, the life draining out of it like water from a cracked vessel. Her voice was steady throughout. The steadiness cost her something. He could see it, the small tension in her jaw, the way her hands held themselves deliberately still. When she finished, she looked away across the pasture, where the new channel was glinting in the afternoon light. "That is why you came here," he said. "That is why I go everywhere," she said, "because I know what happens when no one goes." He did not say anything for a moment. He was thinking about the kind of formation that produces a person like this, the loss and the knowledge and the determination welded together into something that moved through the world with purpose because purpose was what had replaced everything else. "Ada," he said, "I would like to ask you something, and I would like you to answer honestly even if the answer is no." She looked at him. "Ask." "Is there any version of this where you might consider staying?" he said. "Not because I need you to, not because the irrigation project needs you to, because I would like you to." The pause that followed was the longest pause of Simon Carver's adult life. "Staying has consequences," she said. "The Barton County warrant has not been resolved. I'm not entirely a free woman." "I'll go to Barton County next week," he said. "You cannot spend all your time riding to county seats on my behalf," she said. "I can spend my time however I choose," he said, "and this is what I choose." She turned to face him fully, and he saw in her face the war between what she wanted and what she had taught herself to allow herself to want, and he waited with everything he had while she fought it. "I do not know how to stay," she said. "It has been a very long time." "You know how to learn new things," he said. "You have demonstrated that comprehensively." Something in her face moved. It was not a smile exactly, but it was the landscape that produces smiles. And then it became a smile, and it was one of the most complicated and genuine smiles he had ever seen on a human face. "Yes," she said, "I suppose I do." He reached out and took her hand, which was calloused and ink-stained and capable of measuring the gradient of a hillside to within fractions of an inch, and she let him. They stood there in the pasture for a long time, holding hands in the way that people do when they have just decided something enormous, and are standing in the quiet on the other side of the decision. The fourth week brought more complications and also more progress, which was about the ratio that real life tends to produce. The Barton County situation resolved faster than Simon had expected, not because of his advocacy, though he did ride to Barton County and make the case, but because the railroad company that had pressed the original trespass charge had been acquired by a larger company, and the smaller claim had been lost in the paperwork shuffle. The warrant was dropped with the bureaucratic anticlimacticism of most bureaucratic resolutions, a letter arriving at the Caldwell County Sheriff's Office on a Thursday morning that made Horace Prout set his coffee down with an expression of supreme irritation. Ada received the news standing at the creek, measuring the flow rate in the new channel, and her reaction was to nod once and go back to measuring. Simon, who had ridden out to tell her immediately, watched her nod and watched her go back to the measuring, and felt something very warm and very clear in the middle of his chest. He had not expected to fall in love this particular year. He had not expected to fall in love with this particular kind of woman. He had dated over the years women of the conventional frontier type, capable and hardworking in the specific domestic ways that frontier life required, and he had respected and liked them, and the relationships had always dissolved without great drama on either side, like water finding its level. He had begun to think, with a certain equanimity, that he might simply be someone who would build his ranch and run it well and grow old at it, and that would be enough. He was not a man who suffered from loneliness, exactly. He was a man who had made peace with solitude. Ada Finley had made him understand, with a thoroughness that was almost overwhelming, that peace with solitude and contentment in it were not the same thing. The end of the 30-day period, the original term of her custody, arrived with the irrigation project not quite complete, but sufficiently advanced that the remaining work could be supervised by Burl Sykes, and completed by the ranch hands according to Ada's written specifications, which she had produced in a document so clear and comprehensive that it served as a genuine technical manual for maintaining the system in the years ahead. On the morning of the 30th day, Ada appeared at breakfast with her saddlebags. Simon saw the saddlebags and went very still. "I thought we had discussed this," he said. "We discussed the question," she said. "I have been thinking about the answer." "And," he said, "and I have a condition," she said. He waited. "I will stay," she said, "but I will not stay as someone's. I will not stay in a position that makes me dependent on your goodwill or your legal standing. If I stay as a partner in this ranch, an equal partner in the decisions about it, including the water management, which I intend to continue improving, because there are 2 more modifications to this system that could make it significantly more efficient in drought conditions, and I want to implement them." He looked at her across the breakfast table with what he suspected was a very undignified expression on his face. "Yes," he said immediately. "I also," she said more quietly, "have been thinking about what you said, about wanting to know me better. And I believe the same is true for me. I want to know you better. I would like the opportunity to find out what that produces." "So would I," he said, quite urgently in fact. She almost laughed. She pressed her lips together and looked down at her coffee. "You are less reserved than you appear," she observed. "You make me less reserved than I usually am," he said. "That may be relevant information." She looked up at him then with the expression she had worn on the evening the water first moved through the channel, that open, luminous thing that she did not show easily, and he felt the ground under his feet as a specific, joyful, irreversible thing. She stayed. The autumn of 1879 came in with more rain than the summer had withheld. Not dramatically more, but enough. And the holding pond system captured and stored it with the efficiency Ada had designed it for. And by October, the Eastern Corridor ranches were reporting water levels they had not seen since the previous year's good spring. Emmett Rush, who was not a man who expressed gratitude easily or often, sent a letter to Commissioner Gates that acknowledged, with terse and grudging specificity, that the irrigation improvements had saved his operation. Carl Webb stopped making observations about Ada's gender and started asking her questions about soil drainage. Burl Sykes, who had been watching Ada Finley with the calibrated attention of someone who has lived long enough to recognize exceptional people on sight, told Simon privately that he thought she was the most capable person he had ever worked with, and that Simon had better not be foolish enough to let her go. "She's not going anywhere," Simon told him. Burl grunted in satisfaction and said nothing more. Simon and Ada settled into the particular rhythm of two people learning to share space in a way that respects both of them, which is sometimes awkward and sometimes revelatory and always interesting. She kept her notes on the kitchen table, spreading her maps and calculations across half of it in a way that was slightly chaotic and entirely organized by a logic that was entirely hers. He learned to work around the maps, and occasionally to sit down with them and ask questions, which she was always willing to answer with the full and generous attention she brought to any genuine question. He had opinions about the ranch that he held strongly, and she had a habit of examining those opinions with the same dispassionate analytical attention she brought to water systems, which was occasionally uncomfortable and almost always useful. They were not easy together in the way that some couples are easy, but they were real together in a way that Simon came to understand was rarer and better. She challenged him. He steadied her. She expanded his understanding of what the land around him was and could be. He gave her, for the first time in years, a place where her knowledge was not just used but genuinely valued, a home base from which to operate rather than an endless string of temporary encampments. In October, he asked her to marry him. He did it on the porch in the evening, which was where the important conversations between them always seemed to happen, with the autumn stars coming out above the pasture and the creek running at a healthy level in the distance. She was quiet for a long moment, which he had learned not to interpret as reluctance but as the genuine processing of a genuine question. "I need to ask you something first," she said. "Ask," he said. "If I say yes," she said, "nothing about who I am changes. My work continues. The irrigation consulting continues, because there are other places that need this knowledge, and I will not pretend they don't because I have a home now. The legal work continues because the water rights in this territory are still systematically unjust toward communities that do not have power, and someone with knowledge needs to fight that. I will be your wife, Simon. I will also be who I am. I am asking you to marry me because of who you are," he said, "not despite it." She looked at him for a long moment. The searching quality was in her eyes, the one that was always checking for the truth behind a statement, and whatever she found there seemed to satisfy her, as it had repeatedly since that first morning at the creek. "Then yes," she said. He took her face in his hands, which were large and rough with work, and she let him. And when he kissed her, she leaned into it with a completeness that undid him, a wholeness of presence that he understood was not something she offered carelessly, that it was, in fact, a very particular gift. They were married in November of 1879 in the Caldwell courthouse, with Commissioner Gates as a witness and Burl Sykes standing in the back looking very satisfied with himself. Ada wore her good dress, which was navy blue and practical, and she carried a small bunch of dried wildflowers because fresh ones were not available in November, and she saw no reason to pretend otherwise. Simon wore his good coat and his best boots and looked at her walking, toward him with an expression that Burl Sykes would later describe, to anyone who asked, as the expression of a man who has just understood for the first time what the word fortunate actually means. Judge Aldrich, who happened to be visiting Caldwell on county business, attended the ceremony as a guest, and afterward he shook Ada's hand and told her quietly that in his opinion the Drummond warrant had been one of the most unjust filings he had reviewed in 15 years on the bench, and that he hoped the resolution had been adequate. "It was," she said. "Thank you for reviewing it honestly." "It was easily done," Aldrich said. "You gave me a lot to work with." The winter of 1879 and 1880 was relatively mild, and the modified irrigation system held through it with no significant failures. Ada spent part of the winter writing a detailed technical document, a proper manual with illustrations drawn in her precise, elegant hand, describing the full design and construction methodology of the Caldwell Creek corridor system. She sent copies to the territorial engineer's office in Topeka, and to 2 agricultural colleges that had recently opened in Kansas. She received, in February, a letter from a professor at one of those colleges requesting permission to publish an excerpted version of the document in the college's agricultural bulletin. She brought the letter to Simon. He read it and looked up at her with an expression that she had come to love specifically, the one that was pure, unguarded pride. "This is what you should have always had," he said. "Recognition. What I should have had and what I'm getting now are different from what I had before," she said. "I am choosing to focus on what I'm getting now." He pulled her close and she leaned against him, which was still, even months in, something that surprised her slightly each time, the ease of it. The fact that leaning against someone was not the retreat from herself that she had always feared it might be, but simply a good thing, simple and warm and sturdy. Spring of 1880 brought new rain and new work. Ada spent the spring overseeing the final 2 modifications to the irrigation system, the improvements she had mentioned the morning she had made her conditions. One was a more sophisticated overflow management structure at the North Weir that allowed for significantly better flow regulation during high water events, an improvement that would be tested and proven in the wet spring of 1882. The other was a network of subsurface channels under 2 of the larger pastures that used a principle she had learned from Eduardo Reyes and modified for the specific soil conditions of the Kansas prairie, drawing water from the deeper substrate during extended dry periods and maintaining pasture moisture levels that above-ground irrigation alone could not achieve. Emmett Rush, watching the second pasture modification being installed on his property, stood beside Ada as she directed the work and said, with the particular gruffness of a man making an admission that costs him something, "I was wrong about you. You were working with incomplete information," she said, which was kinder than the truth required her to be. "Suppose I was," he said, and then he walked away, which was, from Emmett Rush, practically a ceremony of contrition. In June of 1880, Ada told Simon she was pregnant. She told him on the porch, in the evening, which remained where the important conversations happened. She said it directly because she was a direct person, and then she watched his face. His face did the thing she loved, the unguarded thing. He looked at her with an expression of such complete, uncomplicated joy that it reached into somewhere deep in her and took hold of it, and she felt, with a sudden and overwhelming clarity, that she had made the right choice. That staying had been correct. That this man, this specific man who had picked her map up from the dirt and read it with genuine attention, and then stood up in the town square and advocated for her before he knew her name, was the right person for her life. She was not a crier. She had very firmly not been a crier for most of her adult life, but she felt, in that moment, the specific pressure behind the eyes that indicates the body's desire to mark something important, and she let it happen, just for a moment, just the sting of it. Simon held her on the porch in the June evening, and she let him hold her, which was still a choice rather than a reflex, but increasingly a choice she made without having to think about it first. Their son was born in February of 1881. They named him Thomas Rosa Carver, Thomas for Ada's father and Rosa for her mother, carrying both of them forward into a life they had not lived to see. He was a healthy, strong, furiously opinionated child from the beginning, and by the age of 6 months he had Burl Sykes comprehensively wrapped around his very small finger, and was making his own views on the subject of bedtime known with considerable force. Ada went back to her work 3 months after Thomas's birth, which raised certain eyebrows in Caldwell and raised none at the Double C Ranch, because at the Double C Ranch this was simply how things were and everyone had adjusted to it. She continued her consulting work, traveling occasionally to assist with irrigation projects in adjacent counties, always with clear plans for Thomas's care, and always returning within the specified time because she was meticulous about commitments, which extended to the ones she made to her family. The spring of 1882 brought the heavy rains that tested the modified overflow management structure at the North Weir, and the structure performed exactly as designed, managing a flow that would previously have damaged the channel banks without incident. Ada stood at the weir in the April rain with her hood up and her measuring rod in hand and watched the water move through it correctly and felt the familiar, profound satisfaction of a system working as intended. Simon rode out to find her, which he did when she was quiet for too long and he wanted to check on her, and found her standing in the rain with a smile on her face. "It held," she said. "I never doubted it," he said. "Yes, you did a little," she said. "That big rain event 2 weeks ago had you watching the weir from the ridge for an hour." He conceded this with a slight inclination of his head. "I had concerns," he said. "I was confident in the design." "You were nervous," she said. "It's acceptable. I was also nervous." He climbed down from his horse and stood beside her in the rain, both of them watching the water move with a precision that felt, in this moment, like grace. "Are you happy?" he asked. It was not a question he asked often, because he was not a man who asked questions he was uncertain of the answer to, but this was one of those questions he needed to hear her answer to keep the answer real. She considered it with the same attention she gave to questions about water systems and terrain gradients. "Yes," she said, "I am, entirely." He kissed her in the April rain, which was undignified and completely worth it. The years at the Double C settled into the kind of life that is hard to describe without it sounding ordinary, because from the outside the daily texture of it was indeed ordinary, work and meals and seasons, and the constant small decisions of running a productive ranch. But from the inside it was the specific richness that builds between two people who are genuinely right for each other, layer by layer, season by season, argument by argument, laugh by laugh. Ada's technical manual, after the Agricultural College published their excerpted version in 1880, had begun to circulate more widely than she had anticipated. By 1883, she had received 3 letters from water engineers in other territories who were using her methodology, one of whom had adapted the subsurface channel design for conditions in Arizona Territory with significant success, and wrote to tell her so with a specificity and technical respect that she found deeply gratifying. She wrote back with questions about his adaptations, because she was always more interested in how her methods could be improved than in simple acknowledgement that they worked. She began writing a second document, more comprehensive than the first, covering the full theoretical basis of community water management, as she had developed it from her mother's acequia tradition and her father's engineering training and her own 14 years of applied work. It took her 2 years, working in the evenings after Thomas was asleep and Simon was reading or doing accounts, and when it was complete, it was the most substantial technical work produced by a woman in the Kansas Territory that decade, though no one called it that at the time, and Ada herself would have found the categorization beside the point. She called it what it was, a practical guide to water management for drought conditions in semi-arid climates. She dedicated it to Rosa Finley, her mother, keeper of the acequia. Simon, reading the dedication over her shoulder, said nothing for a moment and then said, "She would have been proud of you. She would have had suggestions," Ada said. "Specific, detailed, probably correct suggestions." "That runs in the family, apparently," Simon said. She elbowed him gently in the ribs. Commissioner Gates, in the spring of 1883, approached Ada with a proposal from the Caldwell County Board of Supervisors to formally recognize her contributions to the county's water management and to appoint her as a consulting hydrologist to the county, a paid position with official standing that would mean her recommendations on water use and rights disputes carried legal weight. It was an unprecedented position for a woman in Kansas, and Gates seemed slightly nervous about how she would receive it. She asked for 24 hours to think about it. She discussed it with Simon that evening. "It means my work is protected," she said. "My recommendations can't simply be overridden by men like Drummond or Rush without a legal process." "That matters enormously," he said. "It also means I am formally associated with this county," she said. "It limits some of my flexibility." "You have a home," he said. "You have Thomas. You have a second child coming in October." She looked at him. "You are not a subtle man." "I was not trying to be subtle," he said. "I was trying to be honest." She accepted the appointment. The second child was a girl, born in October of 1883. They named her Rosa Eliza Carver, Rosa for Ada's mother and Eliza for Simon's grandmother, a woman who had crossed the Missouri River in a wagon in 1848, and about whom Simon spoke with a reverence that Ada had always thought significant. Rosa Eliza arrived with less drama than Thomas had and more personality, which was a considerable achievement, and she had Ada's dark eyes and Simon's calm, deliberate way of taking in new information that made her, from very early, a child who seemed to be constantly and quietly thinking. Thomas adored her with a ferocity that sometimes caused problems, being a 3-year-old who adored things at high volume and with limited regard for personal space. By the time Rosa was 6 months old, she had developed a look specifically for Thomas that combined tolerant amusement and firm instruction in a way that reminded everyone at the ranch of her mother. Burl Sykes, who was 63 and beginning to think about retiring to a smaller operation in Texas, stayed at the Double C specifically because he could not bring himself to leave while the children were small. He told Simon this without embarrassment. Simon told him to stay as long as he wanted and gave him a raise, which was also without embarrassment because it was simply the correct and fair thing to do. In the spring of 1884, a severe drought struck the central Kansas counties south of Caldwell, the worst in 15 years according to the ranchers who had been working the land that long. Ada was called to consult on the water crisis by 2 county boards within 3 weeks of the crisis becoming publicly acknowledged, and she spent 6 weeks traveling between them with her instruments and her notes and her ability to look at a water system in crisis and see what it needed. She was gone for 6 weeks. Simon ran the ranch, managed the children with the help of a reliable woman named Mrs. Hattie Powell, who had come to work at the Double C the previous year, and who was, in Ada's own assessment, the most organized person she had ever met in a domestic context, and he missed his wife with a steadiness and a specificity that surprised him even now, years in. When she came back, she was sunburned and tired and carrying a leather notebook full of new survey measurements, and she walked into the kitchen where Thomas immediately attached himself to her left leg, and Rosa Eliza extended her arms from Mrs. Powell's lap with an expression of dignified expectation, and Ada crouched down with both of them and held them and looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had done essential work and was now home. Simon stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at all 3 of them and felt the specific, wordless fullness of a life that is fully occupied in the best sense. That evening on the porch, after the children were asleep and Mrs. Powell had retired and the Double C was quiet around them, Ada told him about the southern counties. Scale of the crisis there. the failure not just of the water systems, but of the social infrastructure that managed them, communities that had no collective structure for addressing the drought because they had never needed one before and had no model for building one now. They need more than an irrigation fix, she said. They need an educational structure, a system for training local people in water management principles so that the knowledge stays in the community rather than departing with the consultant. "You're thinking of writing something," he said. "I'm thinking of more than writing," she said. "I'm thinking of a program, a traveling school of sorts. Spend a season in a county with a water crisis, implement the immediate engineering solutions, but also teach. Train 3 or 4 local people in each community to carry the knowledge forward. Leave behind not just a system but the capacity to maintain and improve it." He looked at her. He was aware, again, as he had been repeatedly over the past 5 years, of the particular sensation of the world expanding around her, as if her thinking made space that had not previously existed. "That's a significant undertaking," he said. "Yes," she said. "It would require me to be away from here more than I have been." He was quiet for a moment. He was aware of what he felt about that and aware that what he felt about that was less important than what this idea was and what it could do. "Thomas starts at the Caldwell schoolhouse in the fall," he said. "Mrs. Powell is reliable. I can manage, if that's what the work requires." She looked at him with an expression that was not quite gratitude because it went beyond gratitude to something more fundamental, the recognition of being supported in the full breadth of who you are, which is one of the rarest and most sustaining things one person can offer another. "You are an extraordinary man," she said. "I am a man who married an extraordinary woman," he said. "The two things tend to produce each other." She took his hand, as she had taken his hand in the pasture 4 years ago on the day she had agreed to stay, and they sat on the porch in the summer dark and talked about the traveling school program until midnight, planning it together with the collaborative efficiency that had come to characterize how they approached everything. Her vision and technical depth, his practical judgment and knowledge of how people and communities functioned, both of them committed to the same outcome by the different paths their natures had given them. The program Ada developed over the following year was modest in its beginnings and significant in its eventual impact. She called it the Frontier Water Institute, which was perhaps a grander name than its initial scale warranted, consisting of Ada herself and a young man named James Crow Feather, a Wichita man who had grown up working with the traditional water management systems of his community and who had been recommended to Ada by Eduardo Reyes, still working and still generous in connecting people who needed to find each other. James was 23. Precise and observant and deeply knowledgeable about the prairie water systems in ways that complemented Ada's own knowledge, and they worked together with the mutual respect of people who recognize immediately that the other person knows something essential. The first formal training session of the Frontier Water Institute took place in Ford County in the autumn of 1885, with 7 participants, 4 ranchers, a homesteader, a schoolteacher who had decided that water education was as important as reading education, and a 14-year-old girl named Sadie McCord who had ridden 30 miles alone to attend because she had heard there would be a woman teaching, and she had never seen a woman teach anything technical before. Ada added her to the session without comment and watched her absorb every detail with the focused, hungry attention of a person who has been waiting for exactly this. Sadie McCord would, 15 years later, build the most sophisticated irrigation system in Edwards County. Ada learned about it in a letter and read it aloud to Simon over breakfast, and they were both very quiet for a moment with the particular satisfaction of things having propagated correctly. By 1886, the Frontier Water Institute had conducted training sessions in 6 Kansas counties and had begun corresponding with water management programs in Colorado Territory and New Mexico Territory. Ada was occasionally asked to travel to those territories for consultations, and she went when she could and sent detailed written guidance when she could not. Her reputation in water management circles was, by this point, established and substantial, though it remained largely confined to the practical communities that used her work rather than the academic or official circles that might have formally credentialed it. Because the formal credentialing structures of 1886 were not particularly designed for women who had taught themselves from a combination of maternal tradition and engineering manuals. She was philosophical about this. The water moved where she directed it. The communities whose systems she had built or improved were surviving droughts that would previously have broken them. The knowledge was spreading through the people she trained. Whether an institution in the East chose to put her name in a bulletin was secondary. Caldwell had changed in the years since 1879. The Kishom Trail drives were in decline by the mid-1880s as the railroads expanded, and the open range shrank under the pressure of settlement and barbed wire. The town was diversifying, growing new commercial structures, losing some of the raw frontier quality it had had in the early years, and acquiring something more permanent and layered. The disputes over water rights that had once felt existential were now managed through a formal system in which Ada's county appointment gave her genuine standing. And while there were still arguments, sometimes bitter ones, the framework for resolving them was better than it had been. Emmett Rush died in 1886 of a heart complaint, leaving his ranch to a son who turned out to be more reasonable than his father and who, in one of his first acts as the new owner, came to ask Ada if she thought there were any further improvements possible in the irrigation system serving his eastern pasture. She told him yes, there were 2 specific modifications, and she could start them in the spring. He thanked her with the directness and absence of complication that suggested he had been raised to see her as the county's water expert rather than as anything requiring explanation, and she appreciated this more than she showed. Thomas Carver, at age 8, had developed an interest in the engineering aspects of his mother's work that manifested as a habit of following her to the creek on weekends and asking questions that were increasingly sophisticated for his age. Ada answered every question fully and without simplification, because she did not believe in simplifying things for children who were capable of understanding the real answer. Thomas was, demonstrably, capable. Rosa Eliza was quieter about her interests but equally observant, and Ada had found her, on 2 separate occasions, sitting with Ada's survey notes and tracing the elevation lines with her finger in a contemplative way that suggested she was reading them, or attempting to. Simon watched his children interact with their mother's work and felt a pleasure that was not quite describable, the specific satisfaction of watching something important propagate through people you love. Ada had told him once early in their marriage that she went where the need was and did what she could because she knew what happened when no one went. He thought about that often. He thought about the fact that she had come to Caldwell County with her saddlebags and her instruments and her map, at personal legal risk, for strangers, and that one of the things she had found in Caldwell County was a family, which she had not been looking for, which had happened anyway, which was perhaps how the best things happen. The Double C Ranch in the autumn of 1887 was a prosperous, functional, complex operation that bore the marks of 2 people's intelligence and labor in every structure and system on it. The irrigation channels Ada had designed were maintained by a team that included 2 of the ranch hands she had trained herself, and they ran with the reliability of things that have been correctly built. The herd was healthy, the pasture was well managed, and the accounts were solid in a way they had not been in the drought summer of 1879. Ada's 3rd pregnancy was confirmed in the spring of 1887, and her 3rd child, a boy they named Eduardo James Carver, after Eduardo Reyes and James Crow Feather, both of whom had mattered, arrived in November of that year with the calm efficiency that seemed to characterize the Carver children, which Ada privately thought was a function of the fact that she had managed to stay fairly calm throughout each pregnancy by keeping herself productively occupied. Eduardo James was, from the beginning, a sunny and expansive person, which made him very different from his older siblings and also very different from his mother, and Ada adored him with a particular pleasure in the unexpectedness of who he was. Thomas was methodical and serious and deeply interested in how things worked. Rosa Eliza was observant and precise and emotionally perceptive in a way that sometimes made adults feel slightly transparent. Eduardo James was none of these things. He was warm and immediate and delighted by people, and he was going to grow up to be good at something entirely different from irrigation, and Ada thought this was perfect. Simon, on the evening of Eduardo James's arrival, sitting on the porch with the baby in the crook of his arm and the November sky very clear above the pasture, said to Ada, who was sitting beside him wrapped in a quilt and feeling, for the first time in about 16 hours, relatively comfortable, "How did we get here from that morning in the town square?" "You picked up my map," she said. "That's where it started," he agreed. "But how did we get here?" She leaned against his shoulder, carefully around the baby, and looked at the sky. "You were honest," she said. "You said what you thought and then you acted on what you thought. You did not tell me one thing and do another." "And I eventually stopped waiting for that to change." He turned his head to look at her. "You were waiting for it to change. For a while," she said. "I had reasons to wait." "I know," he said. "And then the reasons became insufficient," she said, "compared to the evidence." He kissed her temple carefully around the baby, who made a small sound and then subsided. "The evidence," he said. "The evidence was compelling," she said. "Eventually." He laughed quietly in the November night, and she smiled against his shoulder, and they stayed there on the porch long after the cold should have driven them inside, because the baby was warm and the sky was clear, and they had built the kind of life that makes a person reluctant to move even when they should. The Caldwell Creek corridor continued to function well. In the dry summer of 1888, one of the worst since 1879, the irrigation system held, and the eastern corridor ranches reported losses significantly below those of neighboring counties without comparable systems. Ada's county appointment was renewed and expanded to include consultation rights on any water dispute in the county. The Frontier Water Institute, now with 3 permanent instructors including James Crow Feather, and a woman from Wichita named Clara Bent, who had been one of Ada's first Ford County trainees, had conducted programs in 11 counties across Kansas, and had begun formal correspondence with an agricultural extension program at a university in Lawrence. A letter arrived for Ada from the Territorial Engineer's office in Topeka in October of 1888, requesting her attendance at a planning session for a new statewide water management policy. Kansas having achieved statehood in 1861, and the policy question having taken until 1888 to reach a sufficient level of urgency for serious official action. Ada attended the session in Topeka, which was a long journey by train from Caldwell, the railway having arrived and changed the travel equation considerably from the days of the 30-mile horse ride to Pratt. She came back from Topeka with notes from the session, and a slightly ferocious expression that Simon had learned to read as indicating that something important had happened, and that her thinking about it was not yet resolved. She told him about it that evening on the porch, where all the important conversations remained. The statewide water policy discussion, she said, had included several proposals that were variations on the same error she had been fighting against for 15 years, concentrating water rights in the hands of large interests, formalizing structures that would give established wealth more legal control over water access than small communities and individual homesteaders. The specific legal language proposed was sophisticated, but the effect was the same as the railroads maneuvering she had seen in New Mexico in the 1870s, and this time it was being proposed by people with official standing and the ear of the state government. "You're going to fight it," Simon said. "I am going to fight it," she confirmed. "Do you need anything from me?" "Your support," she said, "and probably the use of the house for several meetings, because I intend to contact every county board that has worked with the Institute and every rancher who benefited from the 1879 system, and I expect some of them to want to come here." "The house is yours," he said, "as it always has been." And she said more quietly, "The knowledge that if this goes badly, if I make powerful enemies doing this, you will not regret having married someone who makes powerful enemies." He looked at her steadily. "Ada, you made Emmett Rush admit he was wrong. You got a Harper County warrant dropped. You built a water system that saved 12 ranches in a drought. I am aware that I married someone who does necessary things with force and intelligence and without asking permission. That is not something I would ever regret." She looked at him with the particular expression that was hers alone, the one that was open and luminous and that she had learned to let him see without controlling it first, the one that told him that she was here, that this was real, that she was his, and he was hers in the full and equal sense that she had always required and that he had always given. "I love you," she said. She said it with the same directness she brought to everything, the same clarity, the same complete absence of performance. She said it as a statement of fact, the most important fact she knew. "I love you," he said, same directness, same clarity, 12 years of it and still the first time every time. She fought the water policy for 2 years. She wrote letters, made appearances, gathered testimony from ranchers and homesteaders and the communities her institute had worked with, and built a coalition that the State Water Board had not anticipated and could not easily dismiss. She lost some of the specific battles because she was fighting against money and influence and the particular inertia of systems designed by and for those who already held power, and she was realistic about this. But she won enough of them. The provisions that would have most severely limited small operator water rights were stripped from the final policy in 1890 after a legislative process that became locally famous for the quality of the technical testimony brought against them, testimony that Ada herself had largely drafted and coached. The legislative fight was covered in the Caldwell Courier, which ran a profile of Ada Finley Carver in June of 1890 that described her as the most knowledgeable water engineer in the Central Plains, whose combination of traditional acequia knowledge and modern survey methodology has produced results that have benefited this county materially, and set a standard of practical hydraulic management that formal institutions have only recently begun to recognize. It was not a perfect article. It still found it necessary to note that she was a woman, and that this made her expertise surprising. And Ada read that sentence with a flat, tired look and moved past it to the parts that were accurate. Simon tacked the article to the wall of his office, next to a copy of the original map from 1879. The years settled. Thomas turned 20 in 1901 and was studying land survey and civil engineering at the University of Kansas in Lawrence, where he had taken his mother's combination of mathematical precision and practical knowledge and was making it into something new, adapted for a new century. Rosa Eliza was 17 and had announced her intention to study medicine, which no one in the family was surprised by and which Ada supported with the same directness she brought to everything, writing letters to the Women's Medical College in Philadelphia and to 2 people she knew in the medical community who might provide useful recommendations. Eduardo James was 13 and deeply interested in people and the structures that organized them, which was pointing, everyone agreed, toward law or politics, and Ada thought this might turn out to be useful in ways none of them could fully predict. The Double C Ranch in 1901 was a mature operation, the original structures replaced or expanded with permanent stone buildings, the irrigation system, a landmark of the county's water management, maintained now by the second generation of people Ada had trained. The town of Caldwell itself had changed enormously in 20 years, the Kishom Trail a memory rather than a current reality, the frontier quality of it replaced by something more settled and durable. Ada, at 50, was not slowing down so much as shifting the focus of her energy. The frontier travel of the Institute's early years had given way to the educational and policy work that could be done from Caldwell with the tools of correspondence and publication, and the network she had built over 2 decades. She was writing the third and most ambitious of her technical documents, a comprehensive history and analysis of community water management systems in the American West, from the indigenous systems that predated European settlement to the complex mix of traditional and engineered approaches that had developed on the frontier, of which her own work was one example. It was the book she had always meant to write. It was the book that would carry her mother's knowledge forward not just in practice but in history, where it belonged. Simon, at 63, remained as present and engaged in the ranch as he had ever been, though he had taken on a foreman younger than Burl Sykes, a reliable man from Texas named Porter, who had the qualities Simon valued: honesty, precision, and genuine knowledge of cattle. He and Ada still sat on the porch in the evenings. The conversations were different now, richer in retrospect and still fully present, the way the conversations of long marriages tend to be when the people in them have kept paying attention to each other. One evening in the autumn of 1901, they were on the porch as the sun went down over the pasture, and Simon said, without preamble, "I have been thinking about that morning in the square." "Which aspect of it?" she said. "The moment I picked up your map," he said. "Before I knew anything about you. What made me do it?" "What did make you do it?" she said, curious, because they had discussed that morning many times over the years, but not always this specific part of it. "The precision of it," he said. "The lines. I could see from where I was standing that whoever drew those lines knew exactly what they were doing. That level of knowledge changes the moral equation. Meaning. Meaning that a person with that much real knowledge, that much genuine ability applied to helping other people, deserves better than to have their map thrown in the dirt," he said. It seemed very simple. She looked at him sideways. It was not so simple for most of the men in that square. "No," he agreed, "but it was simple for me." She reached over and took his hand, as she had taken his hand in the pasture on the day she agreed to stay, and he held it with the same certainty he had held it with every time since. The creek in the distance made its familiar sound, the healthy, purposeful flow of water that had been managed and channeled and maintained with care for 20 years, the living result of a map thrown into the dirt on a desperate July morning by a frightened sheriff who had not understood what he was holding. Ada Finley Carver understood what she was holding. She held her husband's hand in the autumn evening and looked out at the pasture and the sky and the work of 20 years of her life, and she felt, with full and clear certainty, that it was good, that she had done what she had come into the world to do, and she was doing it still, and she was not doing it alone anymore. That last part, which she had once believed to be beside the point, turned out to have been the whole point all along. Not the work sustained by love, or the love made possible by work, but both of them together, neither reducible to the other, each made more fully itself by the presence of the other. The stars came out above the Kansas prairie, the same stars that had come out above a woman measuring a creek with a transit and a chain in the dark of a July morning in 1879, not yet knowing that the man who would hold her map was standing 12 miles away in a ranch that would become her home. The water moved through the channels she had built. The knowledge she had gathered and shared and written and taught was moving through people she had trained, through communities she had helped, through documents sitting on the desks of engineers in 4 territories, through her son in Lawrence and her daughter looking at medical colleges and her youngest child who would someday argue about water rights in a courtroom and be very good at it. Simon Carver held his wife's hand in the autumn dark and listened to the creek and felt that this, specifically this, was what he had been building toward in all the years before July of 1879 without knowing it. Not just the ranch, not just the prosperity, but this particular evening, this particular woman, this particular and irreplaceable life. "Come inside," she said when the night had fully come. "I have 3 more pages to write before tomorrow." "In a moment," he said. "Stay with me a moment." She stayed. The creek ran on in the dark, clean and full and purposeful, the water finding its way through the channels that had been built for it with knowledge and care and love, all the way from the mountains to the plains, all the way from the past to the present, all the way from a map thrown in the dirt in the desperate summer of 1879 to this particular and luminous evening, at the end of which 2 people who had found each other against considerable odds went inside together and shut the door against the night and were home.